today exclusively about the events connected to Maidan. Today is the Day of Dignity, the first anniversary of Maidan, and also 10 years since the Orange Revolution of 2004. So now about Maidans for Ukraine, whether this is the creation of something new or repetition, we will talk with historians Volodymyr Vyatrovich, who is the director of the Ukrainian Institute of National Memory, Kyrylo Galushko, who is historian enthusiast, ethno-sociologist, writer, and the leader of the project League Bez Historic Front, and Andriy Plachotin, who is also a historian and writer. Hello, dear friends. The question that is posed for today's briefing is urgent not only for historians as such. For instance, the kids who will be entering universities next year, you know, they will have in their outside independent assessment, they will have to answer the questions connected to Euromaidan. So Euromaidan becomes a page of history. And for my colleagues, there's a question, how should we interpret Maidan? This is not the first Maidan. And of course, we went through a practice when the previous Maidan and Orange Revolution made it to all the Ukrainian textbooks as a outstanding phenomenon, a new era that changes entirely the life of the country. But on our own experience, we know that it is too little to write in a textbook that the new era has come. So now the historians are only coming to the realization of what this phenomenon was. We have to take into account that maybe the society will wait for very categorical and radical assessments from us very soon. But the historians have to think slower because of our profession, as we are carriers through our profession of some historical experience, not only of Ukraine but world history, when in different countries in the world revolutionary changes occurred. We know that there were several revolutions, 3 revolutions in the Russian Empire, each different from previous one. When there were some democratic shifts and some counter-revolutionary steps, and there were civil wars because of the revolution. So we should not make haste in order to make some categorical conclusions. I tried to follow what the historians wrote after 2004. Analysis and research, there was a lot of arguments and discussion, but they have abated rather quickly, same as the societal optimism. A historian can say that in 2005, as sociology says, the people were expecting powerful and quick changes. The amount of trust to the authority was enormous. It was probably the historical maximum in Ukraine. But all those huge societal expectations ended with 2010. So the cleverest thing that I read as far as analysis of the Orange Revolution is concerned was that it is one thing to create a democracy for yourself for a month, but it is very hard, much more complicated to create democracy for several years, for years and years to come. So when we compared Maidans of 2004 and 2014, first that we think of is that both movements were massive, but they have not transformed into the social industry. It was not as long. It was not a societal shock for many people, and there were no victims then. But from the point of view of the wheels of history moving slowly, An indicator is that over the 3 months of Euromaidan, a huge social industry has emerged, which does not stop even now. However, its direction of things have moved from Kiev to Donbass, for instance. So the 3 months of insecurity and have provoked social instruments that were imminent to Ukrainians in previous periods of history. We can draw some parallels with old Rus Viches meetings, that there was quite a lot of them, which were the gatherings of Kievans in emergency situations, but the old Rus has not become a democratic or civilized society after this, according to modern situations, because those gatherings were people's assemblies were because of emergency situations. They were not a constant mechanism of people's democracy. Then there was a powerful self-organization of Zaporizhzhia Sich. After this, the Ukrainian Cossack statehood was created, which had democratic institutions like Cossack councils, but they also emerged under emergency circumstances. They were not constant bodies. So we may feel that social mentality of Ukrainians possesses a inclination under critical circumstances for the society. People come out and they gather and they solve the issue, but within the intervals between extraordinary situations, it is hard for people to organize constant procedures of the functioning of civil society, like societal control and public control and public initiatives. The difference that we spot immediately is that probably now we have a socially active people who do not stop their activity after Maidan has ended. Of course, this is bad to have such reasons for public activity as war and aggression, but in general we can see now the things that we previously studied only in theory. We studied what the state is, what this public society is. So now we are in the situation when this public civil society is emerging because of the inefficiency of the state. The situation when society and state are separated is probably useful because it mobilized the social capital that there is in the Ukrainian society and makes it work constantly. As skeptics, we will observe and analyze what's happening in the society and how this resource, whether it will become constantly working, and the active level of activity that became bon ton for the new generation that will build the new Ukraine will be acting, and the flash of public enthusiasm does not abate but changes into a constant public control. And then, as historians, we would be able to turn over the page of inefficient Ukrainian state and the page of the history of failed Ukraine and write the beginning of a new chapter, the Ukraine that is happening. Now, Mr. Vietrovich. Okay, we're talking about the 10th anniversary of the Orange Revolution and the first anniversary of Euromaidan. I'll talk about this in two persona, a historian who can distance himself from these events, and as a public activist who took part in both events. The Orange Revolution started for me at 6 a.m. In 2004. Several dozen people from Pora public campaign have stopped several buses that had to go to Poltava or elsewhere to vote for Yanukovych. So we disrupted this plan, and this news made it to the television. And for us, it was the beginning of the Orange Revolution. We are talking quite confidently using the term revolution about Orange Revolution. Now we talk about the revolution of dignity. Another Maidan. I can remind you of another revolution that happened in Ukraine, rather forgotten, the revolution of the granite in 1990. We can talk about 3 Maidans that happened in Ukraine, but were there revolutions? I think they were not completed revolutions, not one of them. Regrettably, the revolution of 1990 that led to the finally led to the restoration of the statehood of Ukraine did not lead to systemic political changes that could give us the right to talk about revolutionary changes. Same in 2004 when Ukrainians came to protest and they won because of their extraordinary efforts, but they could not use the fruit of their labors, of their victory. We have shown an unbelievable ability to mobilize when the situation is critical, but we could not realize this potential in a non-stop regime. As a result, we got what we got. Not only the Orange team was compromised that came to rule the country, but there also was a possibility for people who were the reason for the events of 2004 to come back to power. Viktor Yanukovych and his team started to rule the country, and they began to turn the Ukrainian state back into the past. So the events of 2013-14, for me, I think this was a protest, a resistance movement that finally transformed into an uprising that engulfed practically all of Ukraine, during which there was a seizure of bodies of power, of regional administrations, offices of the Security Service and the Ministry of Interior, the uprising that led to the overthrow of the regime of Viktor Yanukovych. I can, to a certain extent, say that this was anti-Soviet uprising because a component of this uprising was the fight for Ukrainian, pro-European Ukraine. And on the other side of the barricades was Yanukovych's regime that did not conceal their admiration for the Soviet past. They started with rehabilitating this Soviet past, then they started to use the methods of Soviet past in their practice. I mean the prosecution of political opponents who were turned into political prisoners, the censorship that they started to introduce, and also peaceful free gatherings of people. And then the rulers of the country started to shoot people in the center of their own capital. This, for me, was an example of the Soviet past and the desire of Yanukovych's regime to get us back to this past. Also, the territories that were not engulfed by the uprising in January and February of 2014, Crimea and Donbass in the first turn. At the moment, they have an absolutely different fate as the rest of Ukraine. The Crimea is occupied, and there's a terrorist regime in Donbass that is openly appealing to the Soviet past. They use Soviet symbols in their symbolism. They also use old Soviet names for their punitive bodies, and they try to install a total control.
Like the Soviet power in the past, and in the territories where there was no Maidan movement, we can see them coming back to the past. And I'm convinced that without the Maidan, we would have been sliding back into the same pits in all Ukraine. So whether we had to start the protests and the uprising, the answer is definitely in the positive. Despite the victims, and I have some very close friends among them. But still, without the Maidan, Ukraine would have been very much like Belarus. So will we be able to call this a revolution? And on the emotional plane, we are talking about revolution of dignity because of the personal level, the level of individuals, personalities, people who were activated and waken up by the events. Yes, it's a revolution. It's too early to say, though, whether in a societal plane that was a revolution. That the Maidan is not over. It's to be continued in different forms. This is for unity and territorial integrity of Ukraine and big-scale political changes that in some way also affect Ukraine. I mean, the reset of the parliament, and I hope that it will be continued in some systemic political reforms that at the end of the day will become a high item on the agenda of the Ukrainian authorities, and that will, when it's converted into systemic reform, only then we'll be able to see some systemic changes, and we'll be able, as historians, to committed to our textbooks and manuals of history that we had a complete revolution in 2013, 2014. We'll have some time for questions. Andrei Plachonin, good afternoon. My colleagues have discussed the notion of revolution. I would like to discuss the notion of historian and historian. Starting from November, I've been asked about some historic parallels for the phenomenon, but as a historian, not as a citizen, as an academic, as a scholar, not just with a cold mind, but with a cold heart. We are supposed to have that as academics, not as citizens. I was irritated to some extent because historians are enemies to the revolution. They are basically people who have a post-mortem examination. And Vladimir said that there were 3 revolutions. I can say that there are no 3 revolutions. There's one which is not completed. And we come back to this agenda because we cannot conclude it. And we have higher barricades, more talks about reforms, more blood, more casualties. Another thing, we are hindrances to any revolution because the revolution is looking around, trying to borrow the best practices. We are trying to borrow from more successful regimes. Revolution is forward-looking, is proactive. Historians are talking about the past and things that were useful for our grand and great fathers some 100 years ago, but this has very little or nothing to do with the unfolding events. So revolution is supposed to create new things, not to revisit the old things, as historians do, as academics, not citizens. And I was very surprised to discover my colleagues here to commemorate this first anniversary. Is it the time when I think this is not the case. I understand why we invite historians to this briefing, because this is a specific revolution. It's taken place against the backdrop of this intervention, not just the armed one, but the ideological war levied against Ukraine. And first, they occupied the minds of the people, and then the cities where those people were residing. And in that with the project that Cyril is leading. This is the Leak Pass project. This and the need experts in physics, physicists, modern historians. Speaking of our northern eastern neighbor, it's a landfill. Russia is a landfill of ideas abandoned by the world in the 19th and the 20th century. It's a melting pot, not in terms of the U.S. Melting for different ethnic backgrounds, but rather for ideas abandoned by all the other people. Can we imagine communists as a orthodox fundamentalists 20 years ago? And in the Middle Ages, we had that bestiary book with different beasts combining features of well-known animals like a bird, a serpent, a fish, and a lion at the same time. They could not exist anywhere. In modern Russia, we can have such freaks of nature galore, but in terms of ideology and the carriers of such ideology, distortion of the past, creation of the new myth, and revival of the old ones. This is the feature of that melting history pot. History became the first victim of such experiments, and history became the main means for carrying the infection, the ideological weapons of the Russian making. And the Ukrainian revolution is one of the chapters of this big confrontation, the big crisis that is now imposed by Russia on the whole world. And in that global conflict, history is one of the biggest weapons of Russia. Creation of the old myth, recreation of the old myth, creation of the new ones, recreation of the Russian society. Western intellectuals, radicals should be pulled over to the Russian side. And the east and the south of Ukraine, we had some radical political forces being revived. And another very important point, speaking of the computer bugs do not always break the system, but they always slow it down. So computer bugs with false information, history myth, this slows down the response from the West, and they cannot, in an adequate and timely fashion, respond to the challenges, and the system is frozen. And that's why the system and the modern ideological weaponry is all arranged around history as a discipline, as a subject. For Russia, it is necessary because Russia failed to enter the 21st century. It's on the in the ditch of the history, and China in 1989 and Russia at the same point, the same starting position. Russia is sliding back, sliding down. China is going forward, so Russia is lagging behind and is trying to turn all the eyes to the past where it belongs. So modern Russia, once with the information war and with the history method to bring the world back, or the Ukrainian revolution is a response to this. This is not the past, not like we were trying to draw parallels with the past starting from last November. And Europe and the world have to answer to the challenges of Russia. And Russia is afraid of it because Russia is doomed to remain in the ditch of history and in the gutters of history. And they are trying to fight Ebola virus, and they have the equipment, and we have our qualifications. As historians, with ideological able, we can fight that ideological Ebola like this.
Thank you very much. I now understand that we did have to arrange a round table, not a briefing, because the topic is so interesting and the speakers are so interesting. Do we have questions? I have a question to Kirilo Galushko, who is not only a historian, but he is also an ethno-sociologist. Although you do not like to draw parallels with 2004, but now Ukrainians also have disappointment with many guests whom we talked to, with relatives of the heroes of Heavenly Hundred. They all do not see the results that they were standing for on Maidan. They would like to see more reforms, more things done in the country, and not one of those who took part in the bloody safari in Maidan was not punished. There is a disappointment, same as there was in 2005. So my question is, are these heightened expectations of the people? Because 1 year is a very short time in historical measurement. Maybe we should have more patience and wait, and not to arrive at hasty conclusions. I understand, but the matter is not about the heightened expectations of people. Every time when such dramatic things happen, when people sacrifice something, they want to have at least moral compensation for this, that their beliefs, that their efforts, that they have overcome the fear of death, gets a proper assessment, and they want life to change. This is in human nature. So I'm coming back to what I was talking about in the beginning. The people's enthusiasm abates very quickly. You cannot all the time be in such a huge nervous tension and apply such huge efforts. So the main task now is not to resort to passiveness and disappointment, but the difference between what we see now and what was here 10 years ago is that the society has become radicalized, and we have gained the experience of positive actions. And this means that if we witness another Maidan, I would not like this to happen, but if it happens, then it will very fast go to some violent radical actions, because we should not forget that thousands of our people have got combat experience from the front line. And also there's another factor of the mood with which these people will come back home. We know that there will be huge amount of arms coming from there. There's also frontline brotherhood, and when these people will meet unjust behavior towards them or some frontline crisis situation, their reaction as frontline men will be radical and quick. I remember as a historian the situation in Europe in 1920s, when all the countries went through a very hard and dramatic experience of the First World War, and those who survived and came back wanted radical changes in the world. So there was quite a lot of new democratic regimes, and they were ruined by radicals who came back from the front, who had absolutely juxtaposed ideologies from communism to fascism. But for them, ideology is not the main thing, but the solution of the problem. Everything, and immediately we know what this led to. The guilty ones are not the frontline men who shed their blood for their countries. The blame was on the political regimes that were unable to quickly adapt to the change of social behavior, of the social mood. The problem of Mr. Yanukovych, to a great extent, was that people who worked for him did not read the data from Ukrainian sociology, because there were many indicators of what the society wants and which protest moods are rising there. So the future of Ukraine, to a great extent, will depend on how seriously the current state and current authority view what has happened, because we know that the shock of political passivity is coming away swiftly, same as enthusiasm. So it tends to, for instance, go along the same route as a streetcar that follows one and the same route. So the people who would understand that the society has changed and it can respond not in a tender way as it was previously, this might become a stimulus for reforms, because this is not an issue of symbolic changes. This is an issue of internal security and safety of the state, which is endangered from abroad. And of course, this is a dual question, as to the extent to which what is the extent to which the active mood in the society will remain, and how efficiently will work the state so that social institutions do not replace state institutions, because there's quite a lot of mood like we don't need this state because we still have to do everything instead of them. So the state has to work now, because people cannot work on enthusiasm for this immense period of time. Mr. Vetrovich, do you agree with this? Maybe the government expects that the political shock will pass away and they will be able to go to reforms then. You know, the changes in Ukraine are possible under two conditions. One, the authorities are ready for the changes, they understand that they are necessary, and the situation is pushing the authorities towards this. I think that radicalization of the society is the rulers are aware of this, and they understand that there may be a social explosion linked to foreign aggression, but also there has to be a societal preparedness. Ukrainians have marvelously showed themselves as dissidents and protesters who can topple foreign regimes, but there's too little experience of how their own state mechanism is formed. So we have to see the unity of authority and community and society. There has to be some time yet to assess what has happened, but this time has not to be the time of waiting. This has to be the time of work. There's a lot of analogies being made with the Moses' people who were wandering across the desert 40 minutes for 40 years, and we have only 23 years of independence. But Moses' people were not waiting, they were going, and they were looking for something. We don't have much time to change the paradigm. I have several questions, but and I have an impression that if we look at our history over the period of independence of Ukraine, it's like a seesaw, and this seesaw is going around the bigger and bigger amplitude. There was Maidan in 2004, then there was a recoil, and now there was even a bigger swing. How dangerous this is? This is my first question. And the second is, how do you assess the probability of a military dictatorship in Ukraine? As far as seesaws are concerned, you know, Volodymyr told us about a danger or a threat of a new Maidan. I have to continue. Volodymyr went away, so I'll continue this thought. We saw the example how this ends when in summer they tried to remove what has remained of Maidan. We saw that there was a split in the society about this, not about the question who is for Russia or who is against Russia, but about those who remained in Maidan. And this is the biggest threat, not the toppling of the state or the regime, but the further split within our camp. So this is probably the biggest challenge on this from Russia. It counts on this, and it is pressurizing us. About the military dictatorship, I would tell you a year ago that this is impossible because Ukraine does not have military. Now we have military reform. It is only starting. What do you mean, the military dictatorship? The battalions who will come back. This is not military dictatorship. This is radicalization that Kirilla was talking about. And in order to have a military dictatorship, there should be a general like Pinochet or Franco, the regime of the top brass. At the moment, we still do not have the stable military top brass. We don't have conservative values that, in principle, those top military defend. I am all the time called liberal. I tell them I am a conservator. And I tell them, they tell me, how can you be a conservator if you are revolutionary? And I tell them a conservator is he who defends conservative values. But we still have to acquire them. So I do not see ideological prerequisites or an army that could control this state after the coup. But these battalions will come back, and we had people from battalions in briefings. They are not satisfied with the present government, and we see that there are attempts on the part of General Prosecutor's Office to put them to order, and this is inevitable. So to reformulate the question, is Ukraine in for radicalization? Yes, this is inevitable, but on the other hand, in order to fight this radicalization, we have to radicalize the reforms of the governments. Yeah, there has to be a competition. Who is more radical, the guys from the street or the government? And in this respect, the government still has all cards on its hands, and it is only desired that they use this. I would not venture to provide forecasts because this is not for historians. Maybe futurologists should do this. I would like to add something about the seesaw that you mentioned. Though it is important to understand what kind of seesaw this was, between what and what. This was a pendulum that was swinging between the post-Soviet regime and the Ukrainian direction of the movement of the state. However, the situation of military threat, we saw that the Ukrainian identity positions itself in those regions and some social strata that before that were passive or indifferent. For instance, the situation with Dnipropetrovsk, that we understood that there's no southeast, there's south and east. It tells us that maybe in our national identities, the Ukrainian society have gone over a threshold of consolidation, so that the pendulum would be not between Ukrainian and Soviet, but a pendulum between one and the other end of Ukrainian. So there would not be a question, what is Ukraine, where is Ukraine, or for instance, Soviet nostalgia. Inside every nation, every country, every state, there is an internal pendulum. Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives, but this is normal. Within the framework of democratic process, when you do not doubt the essence and the existence of the state. So I hope that this seesaw is running to an end here, and there will be a new one. If there are no questions, thank you very much. We will invite you more than once to the Ukrainian Crisis Media Center to talk on these topics. Thank you very much. We will continue at 3 p.m. with the briefing with the relatives of the heroes of the Heavenly 100. Thank you.